Hey, my name is Chris Brennan, and you're listening to the Astrology podcast. This episode is a recording of an interview that I did with a journalist named Abi Millar, who's a science journalist that is writing a book titled The Spirituality Gap, where she's going to explore a range of different spiritual practices and examine how people make sense of life in the modern world. So as a science reporter, Abby was approaching the subject from more of a skeptical perspective, but she said that she hoped to maintain a balance between skepticism and open-mindedness. She asked me if I wanted to do an interview for a chapter of the book that's going to be on astrology, and I said that I would agree under the condition that we could record and release the discussion as an episode of my podcast, which she agreed to do. So I thought this would be a good opportunity to record an episode with somebody who is skeptical but curious about astrology, and to sort of demonstrate how I would personally answer some of the questions about astrology that naturally come up in that context. In some ways, this is a continuation of a similar approach that I took in episode 288 of the Astrology podcast, which was entitled Explaining Astrology to Non-Astrologers. And if you enjoy this episode, then I'd recommend checking that one out as well. All right, let's get started with the interview. Hey, my name is Chris Brennan, and you're listening to the Astrology podcast. Joining me today is Abbi Millar, and we're going to be doing an interview where you have some questions related to a book that you're writing about a number of different things. So could you first, tell me a little bit about yourself and about this book that you're working on?
Hi, Chris. Well, thanks for having me on the podcast. It's really nice to speak to you today. So my name's Abi Millar. I'm a British journalist, and I'm working on a book called The Spirituality Gap, which is going to be published by Duckworth Books in late 24, early 25. And the book is sort of profiling different forms of spirituality that have emerged as traditional religion has declined. So astrology is obviously one big example. I'm also going to be looking at practices like tarot, Reiki, even psychedelics, meditation. So that's why I'm speaking to you today. I thought that you'd be a really interesting person to speak to for the astrology chapter.
Cool. Awesome. And you've done a lot of journalism. Your journalism is focused on science reporting primarily in the past up to this point?
That's correct, yes.
Okay, got it. All right, cool. Why don't we start with your first question, where I think you wanted to ask about my background, right?
Absolutely. So I'm really interested in why you became an astrologer and what your own journey towards it involved. So at what point in your life did you discover astrology, and what was it about it that appealed to you or convinced you of its relevance?
Sure. So I discovered astrology, like real advanced astrology beyond sun signs, because I think everybody has some basic familiarity of sun signs relatively early in life. But I discovered it late in my teen years, the concept of birth charts, because it was around the year 1999 and it was the turn of the millennium. And I started studying some books on Nostradamus and got into some New Age things. And one of the things that I discovered through that was the concept of the birth chart and transits, and the idea that astrology was more complex than I thought previously. And I really began studying it very intensely from that point, and decided that that's what I wanted to focus on and study, including going to college for that after high school in order to focus my studies on astrology. And while I eventually stopped, I sort of fell out of interest with some of the New Age and other types of things that I was focused on up to that point. Astrology was the one thing that stuck with me, because I thought that there was a empirical component to it that I could validate through repeated observations. So that was the reason why I decided to continue pursuing that and focusing on it, in addition to just that I found it really fascinating, the concept that that should work at all, or the concept of the birth chart could work at all.
It's really interesting.
Yeah, because realistically, like as a normal Western, person that has always had an interest in science, or has a genuine interest or grew up learning basic things like that. We grow up in a cultural circumstance where there's not really a place for astrology, and that's not really something that we think should work or does work. And yet, for some reason, seeing that it did, there was something very fascinating to me about that something like that could work, and what that said about the nature of the world and cosmology and all sorts of things like that. And I found some of those questions so fascinating that I just wanted to pursue that and try to take it as far as I could.
Speaking of the cosmology of it, I mean, that's something that I'm really curious about. So, for the time being, at least, I'd characterize myself as a skeptic when it comes to astrology, although I'd say I'm very open minded at the same time. And my main reasoning for that is even if, as you say, it does work, I can see no reason why it should work. So, can you tell me a little bit about the sort of cosmology or worldview that underlies and why exactly should the position of the stars at the moment of somebody's birth tell you anything about what's going to happen to them in life?
Sure. Yeah, I think that the basic definition of astrology, my basic definition and my summary of most traditions of astrology and what they all have in common is this basic premise that there's a persistent correlation between celestial movements and earthly events. And that's it. And that's the basic definition of astrology. And there's different branches of astrology or different applications of astrology that take that basic premise and apply it in different ways. For example, there's the oldest form of astrology is mundane astrology, which is that major celestial movements will sometimes correlate with major events on Earth that affect lots of people. For example, like if an eclipse happens in the ancient world and then a king died at the same time, that would be viewed as a correlation between like a celestial movement that happened in the sky that then affected like an entire city or kingdom or what have you. And then that premise is also extended to other concepts or other branches, such as natal astrology, which is the premise that the alignment of the planets at the moment that an individual is born will say something about both their character, the nature of their life, as well as their future. And I think that's the type of astrology that most people are familiar with. But all of that just goes back to the basic premise that there's a correlation between celestial movements and earthly events.
Yeah, so it's really interesting, especially because, as you say, there's a kind of element of empirical observation involved there, um, which
Yeah.
ties into a question I had about whether you consider astrology to be a science per se. And I know there's some kind of debate over what constitutes a science versus a pseudoscience. Where do you draw the line between the two? Do you feel like it's missing the point to be talking about astrology in scientific terms at all? Should we be thinking about it more as maybe an art form or as a religion? Or is it really a kind of scientific pursuit as far as you're concerned?
I mean, well, first you'd have to answer the questions like first, is the premise true? Like, are there actually correlations between celestial movements and earthly events? And because if that's true, then it's reflecting something about a basic property that's occurring in nature. And therefore, that is something that's sort of within the purview of science to the extent that science is just trying to understand the nature of the cosmos and understand the nature of different things that are actually occurring in nature, different phenomenon. So I think it is to that extent that it's studying something, if it's a legitimate property in nature, is scientific in what it's trying to accomplish. But whether it's developed based on the principles that are usually applied in a modern scientific setting, like the scientific method, then astrology is not usually practiced or developed in that context because astrology hasn't been part of universities or the mainstream scientific paradigm for several centuries now. So it wouldn't constitute a science in the sense that it's not usually being practiced in that sort of strict scientific context.
And you say that it hasn't been sort of treated as a science for a few centuries. And my understanding of astrology, which is fairly basic, is that if you look at the distant past, astrology and astronomy were treated almost as two sides of the same coin, or they were the same discipline before actually they diverged. And astronomy continued to be seen as a respectable science, whereas astrology didn't. And I know you're a lot more well versed in the history of astrology than I am, so I was wondering if you could tell me a bit about what happened there.
Sure. I mean, I don't know if there's a debate about this, but there's a common presumption in texts both on the history of astronomy and the history of astrology that astrology and astronomy have always been intertwined and that they used to be one and the same in the ancient world. And I think there's a certain extent to which that's true, to the extent that there have been famous astronomers who are also astrologers, like Claudius Ptolemy in the 2nd century, or later Johannes Kepler, or even Galileo. But I think there has always been somewhat of a distinction where astronomy has been about the observation and measurement of the heavens, while astrology is about the study of the correlations between celestial and movements and earthly events. And those are kind of distinct things, even though they're both, focused on a similar area of this. They're focused on the sky and they're drawing on similar data. There's still a distinction there, so that one of the objections I've had is that they've not always been one and the same, even though they have somewhat parallel paths due to the common things that they're drawing on to a certain extent. So I guess I wanted to say that first, just to establish that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It does.
Yeah, and I think that's why, part of my argument for that is that, on the one hand, while you have famous, astronomers like Ptolemy who wrote a work on astrology, he also wrote a separate work on astronomy, and those weren't, those were sort of separate books, basically, rather than just like combined treatments of astrology and astronomy. And I think if there had been absolutely no distinction between astronomy and astrology, that those would have been merged much more, or treated at the same time rather than being treated separately. So that's, it's like a minor point, but it's kind of an important point that perhaps, even though they were more intertwined, and if you go further back into the Babylonian tradition, you did have these long traditions of, sometimes family traditions, of people going out and looking at the stars every night and doing observational astronomy, but also then sometimes writing down correlations of events that happen on Earth at the same time. And maybe in those, astronomy and astrology were a bit more merged at that point. But by centuries later, when they're writing like separate works on astronomy and astrology, I think there's at least some divergence already happening there relatively early on.
Interesting. And why would you say it was that astrology actually fell out of favor, whereas astronomy itself didn't?
Sure. So one of the issues is that the fall of astrology had a lot more to do with a paradigm shift that occurred in the Renaissance, especially during a relatively quick succession of events that changed our cosmology, and that kind of rendered the cosmology that had been used up to that point obsolete. And astrology was kind of like an incidental casualty of that in some ways. So it's like you have a scientific paradigm that exists all the way up until that point. But then all of a sudden, that not even just that scientific paradigm, but that cosmology or worldview is suddenly overthrown, and astrology just happened to be connected with it up to that point. So astrology becomes just like an incidental casualty of that. Because one point that's important is, it's not like all of a sudden, people did a bunch of scientific studies in the 1700s that suddenly showed that astrology was like statistically not valid or not true. Like, that's not what was happening at that point. And that's usually how scientific things are established, in modern times, of whether you determine if something's scientifically valid or not valid. But instead, it was that there was this shift in the worldview of how the cosmos worked that suddenly changed. And astrology, just because up to that point for a number of centuries it had been taking that worldview for granted as part of its just assumption about why astrology works, that becomes part of the reason why things changed all of a sudden. Does that make sense? So there's other pieces to that I'll explain, but I just want to make sure that sort of what I'm saying up to this point makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
It
does.
So the other part of it is that part of why that happened is that our astronomical cosmology up to that point, up until the Renaissance, was partially based on Ptolemy's view of the cosmos, which put the Earth at the center of the solar system. And this became sort of a foundational paradigm for astronomy up to that point, and was our rationale for the situation of why the planets were doing what they do and moved in the ways that they did And Ptolemy wrote this really major astronomical work in the 2nd century that all subsequent astronomical works and works on cosmology then were based off of. And he was able to do that partially because he improved the practice of astronomy up to that point, and he was able to create a new paradigm for astronomy that worked really well, or at least worked better than the system up to that point, and therefore established his astronomical works as like the best paradigm and best approach and the easiest and most effective approach to take for astronomy and predicting where the planets will be in the past as well as the future up to that point. So everybody followed and emulated Ptolemy after the 2nd century. But Ptolemy was a polymath, and he, specialized in a number of different fields. He also wrote works on optics, on harmonics, and he also on geography, and he also wrote a book on astrology because he was he was like a genius or a polymath, and he was trying to like create this almost like unified scientific view of the world that tied together all these different fields of knowledge that were matters of science at that point, and to create a scientific paradigm that took into account or made room for all of those under one umbrella. So one of the ones he tried to do that for was astrology as well. And part of what he tried to do is he tried to justify or explain astrology within the context of the prevailing scientific paradigm in his day, which is in the 2nd century. So part of what he tried to do was explain astrology within 2nd century causal cosmology, which believed that there were sometimes influences or effects that were coming down from the planets and that were affecting things on Earth, and that became part of his justification for astrology, just because that was like the scientific concept that made the most sense at that time. So the analogy is kind of like if there was a scientist or a polymath today in the early 21st century, like let's say like a Neil deGrasse Tyson or somebody like that, who came up with a justification for astrology within the context of what we currently know about science and how the world works. Like let's say he took some parts of like Einstein's theory of relativity and he merged it with like some current prevailing ideas about quantum mechanics or whatever we currently think we know about quantum mechanics. And then that explains or it provides some current justification for astrology, so that it's not just a matter of people applying astrology and it working, but all of a sudden there's a broader paradigm that makes sense within our current cosmology about how it could work, because that becomes one of the biggest objections. And it was one I know that you raised at one point, where you said that you had a consultation with somebody and it worked, or at least it seemed like they did a good job and that astrology worked, but that you assumed it must be confirmation bias and kind of rejected it because you said that there's no way that this could work, or you don't understand how this could be possible within the context of what you currently know. So therefore it must not be true, even though you had that personal subjective experience of feeling like maybe there was something there. So that's basically what Ptolemy did, is he created something that was true at the time. But imagine if that paradigm that's created today by a scientist 1,000 years ago, our current scientific understanding of the world is disproven because they've created or they've come up or discovered something new about the nature of the cosmos, and it creates a new scientific paradigm at the time, which then incidentally throws out the old paradigm. But if some people had rationalized astrology based on that paradigm from the early 21st century, then astrology would accidentally get thrown out as well, just as a incidental part of the cosmology, because people had too closely associated their broader explanation for how it could work with just some current scientific paradigm. And scientific paradigms are always shifting every few centuries because our understanding of science and of the world is always not preliminary, but it's sort of temporary based on what our current data and current understanding is, but it's always subject to change and growth and revision.
I see what you're saying. And is that an argument for kind of not really being too bothered by the underlying causal mechanism, and just kind of, is it an argument for saying this appears to work because according to the evidence I'm looking at, it seems to work, and to sort of disregard even needing to understand why. Is it an argument for that, perhaps?
To a certain extent, I think it's important that we come up with an overall justification in cosmology for astrology, but it's not the main thing. The primary thing is just to establish whether it works and what you can do with it, in the same way that, I can use a microwave to like heat up food without necessarily knowing how the scientific details of how microwaves work and the like science underlying that necessarily. You can be an operator of a piece of technology like a car without necessarily knowing the mechanics fully behind a car in either a scientific or even a sense of like becoming a mechanic who could like build and or take apart a car and then rebuild it or what have you. There's a certain extent to which most astrologers are people that are using and participating in something that is what we think is a legitimate property of the cosmos without necessarily having all of the answers for why exactly it's doing that. Because if it's true that it works, it's obviously going to be a huge thing that needs to be justified and explained within a broader scientific paradigm. But that doesn't mean that you have to have that in order to use it or just observe the phenomenon for what it is, if that makes sense. So I have my own personal views, and each astrologer comes up with different philosophical and cosmological or scientific reasons for why they think it works based on their current understanding of the world and based on the current prevailing, perceptions about how the world works and how cosmology is set up. But there's a certain amount of, when it gets to those big picture questions, that it's a little bit beyond the scope, I think, of any individual person and what their personal rationale is, whether that's actually the only singular rationale or whether it's, not necessarily.
Okay, and to go back a little bit to what we were talking about earlier, whether it functions more akin to a science or akin to a religion, do you believe in astrology because of the empirical evidence that you sort of see, or do you feel there is a leap of faith at some point along the process?
No, I wouldn't. I can say really definitively that I wouldn't practice astrology if I didn't think it worked, and if I didn't continue to have that perception reaffirmed. Sometimes even despite my skepticism of, being surprised. Like I'm continually, and I think it's a experience that a lot of more professional astrologers have, of being continually almost surprised and sort of like entertained, like the fact that this works at all, or the fact that you do see these correlations over and over again. But I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't continue to do this if I didn't think it worked. And I think that's actually a common misconception, especially amongst professional skeptics, where sometimes it's framed that astrologers know somehow that what they're doing doesn't work and they're just doing it in order to like rip people off or make money or lie to people or something like that. And that's like an outsider's view on things, which I think if you spend like 5 minutes in the astrological community, you realize pretty quickly, whether these people are, deluded or crazy or not, they genuinely believe that what they're doing is valid and that they're practicing something that's a genuine like property of the universe. Whether or not that's correct or not is sort of a separate thing. But for me, I wouldn't keep doing it if I didn't think that it was actually working.
Oh, yeah. I mean, having talked to astrologers, I don't doubt for a second that people are genuinely serious about this. I suppose I'm more curious about where the belief comes from. And so, yeah, I did, as you mentioned, have my own birth chart read by an astrologer, and I was really struck by kind of how much it resonated. And yes, I suppose kind of where the challenge for me lies is I don't know whether any birth chart that I was given would also have resonated, because you're dealing with archetypes here that are sort of somewhat universal. And if I'd been given a completely different birth chart full of the same kind of universal archetypes, would I have had the same kind of gut reaction that, yes, this is correct, this is about me? So I don't know whether I'm making sense here. Birth charts are a lot more specific than I'm giving them credit for. What's your take on this?
Yeah, I mean, I thought I thought your reaction to that was really interesting because in the original question that you wrote, you said, I had my own natal chart read recently and it does seem uncannily accurate, but
Yeah.
without understanding the causal mechanism, I'm inclined to put this down to confirmation bias. And I thought that was really interesting because it meant, at least in your perception, there was something there where it seemed like it was working, even despite your initial preconceptions before going into it, that surely this shouldn't work or shouldn't do anything. Astrology shouldn't work, basically, is the presumption that most normal people should have going into something like this. But then you're confronted with an experience where, for some reason, it does seem to be working. But then because, cosmologically or philosophically, you still have this presumption that it can't work or that you don't know a mechanism for why this could work, that there's an assumption then that your perception must just be faulty and this is still wrong. And therefore, you should sort of reject it despite having that experience. I thought that was really interesting because there's like an element of almost like faith there, ironically, that's leading you to reject it, even having seen something that some evidence like to the contrary. And it almost felt like an issue of faith there to a certain extent because you believe almost so strongly of the perception going into it that it can't work, that you're willing to disregard your own perception that it might or that it could. Which is, I'm not like putting that on you necessarily or attacking you and saying that, but it's an interesting, for me, just reflecting on your reaction to it, because I think a lot of people in your position would have a similar reaction, or a lot of people with a science education or a more skeptical bent or approach to things would have a similar reaction to it. But it was something that was interesting, I don't know, to reflect on of why and if those motivations are correct or what the actual truth is, since we're coming from different perspectives.
No, I'm not necessarily rejecting it either. I'm very curious about it. I'm just kind of wondering where my own sense that resonates comes from, because for me, I suppose it's easier to kind of think to myself, I'm probably having this reaction because of, it's archetypes, and because I could use my creativity and my imagination to sort of work out how these archetypes apply to me. But I wonder whether another one would apply similarly. So it's kind of easier for me to sort of think that than it would be to sort of, I guess, have the whole paradigm shift in my mind. But I definitely don't want to reject it out of hand. I'm just sort of curious to explore more a little bit, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, I know, confirmation bias is an issue, and that's a thing. And I think especially the more generally something is written, for example, if we're talking about like a newspaper horoscope that's just maybe a sentence or two, and if it's something that's written so generally that it could be applied to anyone, so that there's no way to like validate that, really, there's no almost like falsifiability, then yeah, you can run into issues with confirmation bias. But when you get into the more advanced forms of astrology that are saying, even though they're still speaking in a language of archetypes, which sometimes can be more broad because archetypes can be multivalent, and there's different ways that an archetype can manifest in specific ways that are still true to the overarching umbrella concept. I don't think that when you're doing these more advanced forms of astrology that use an actual birth chart, that it usually is stated so broadly that you can't determine whether that's an accurate statement or not. And I think contrary to usually when this argument is brought up about confirmation bias and like the horoscope argument is mentioned, that just becomes a sort of explanatory mechanism to explain away how people could have the perception that astrology is working without it actually being true. But as anybody that does consulting astrology on a regular basis can tell you, if you sit down with a person, you start talking to them about their life, if you start saying things that are not true to a person about their life, the vast majority of people will be very quick to tell you, no, that's not an accurate statement, or no, that doesn't resonate with me. So there is a way in which there's a falsifiability, or there's a way in which astrologers actually do find out pretty quickly if something they're saying is not true, or if the astrology is not working, or if their interpretation of it is not good. So that's something that's, again, there's like explanations from outside the astrological community of how to explain astrology away, of that it's not working, but it's like based on an assumption that people will always just take something for granted about their life as being true if it's said to them. But in actual practice or actual experience, that's actually not true. People will be very quick to reject something if it doesn't fit or doesn't resonate or just doesn't accurately reflect their life.
That's interesting. I was wondering if you knew if there'd been any research to that effect. I was thinking, for instance, if you gave people a selection of birth chart analyses and sort of said, can you guess which one of these is yours? And then if you repeated that a few times and more often than not, people got it right, I suppose that would seem like meat for an argument that there's something to it, just based on kind of current scientific methodologies. Are you aware of any research to that effect at all?
Yeah, there were some studies like that were done in the 80s, like some small scale studies. One of the issues that you run into, though, with studies like that is that they need to be replicable under a very controlled set of circumstances. But one of the issues is that because of the lack of university support and because of the lack of standardization within the field of astrology, there's a huge degree of variability in terms of the training and the skills amongst different astrologers and the approaches amongst different astrologers when they're reading charts. And I think for something like that to be truly done well, there was like some haphazard studies done in the 80s that you would have to have a certain amount of like knowing who the participants are, knowing that they've had good training in astrology, and knowing that they've also had similar training in astrology in order to make sure you're controlling most of the variables involved. And most of the time when I've seen studies like that, it's just picking sort of somewhat random astrologers that may not have even been in the field for more than like a few months or a year or something like that. And then just like seeing how they do. And that's not really a good way to do a study like that. But there's studies like that would be interesting. There's another one that I've been working on, which is a rectification study. And the idea behind this is that if the premise of natal astrology is true, that the birth date and time and location of your birth will create a birth chart that will emphasize certain planets and certain signs of the zodiac in a person's life, and that an astrologer can read that chart and it will accurately say things about a person's life. One of the things that sometimes people run into is that they don't have a birth time recorded, or they have a birth time recorded, but it's rounded to the nearest hour. It's like approximate or something like that. So one of the processes that astrologers have always had to learn eventually is called rectification, which is where an astrologer takes a person's birthday and they have, let's say, an approximate birth time, and they try to reverse engineer the chart to establish what the correct birth time is based on events that are known about a person's life. So that actually, I think, would be a more interesting and compelling test if you had enough, like a decent group of astrologers that were well trained in rectification, and you sat them down and you have an astrologer that's sitting in front of a client and they're able to ask the client questions so that it can accurately reflect what happens in an actual consultation. And then the astrologer has to correctly infer whether the person was born at one time during the day or if they were born an hour or two later, that they have two birth times in front of them and they have to choose the correct one. So that's another like version of that test. But like one of the issues is it gets really tied into, obviously the astrologer has to be able to talk to them and ask questions about the person. And I know that there can be accusations in that context about cold reading or other things like that. So you'd have to like control for different variables like that. And that's a similar issue with even just sitting down and reading people's charts ahead of them, because sometimes people try to control those variables by saying, by doing other things like making it so the astrologer can't talk to the person directly. But I think that then takes it too much out of the natural element that's like necessary or closely tied into how an astrologer normally works. So it doesn't quite work in the same way.
I see. That's really interesting. And would
Yeah.
you like to see sort of more large scale research studies conducted in this field generally, or do you feel like kind of trying to prove things sort of scientifically is kind of beside the point?
I was much more interested in this early on, and I was much more like actively interested in things like that. But most of my program has been because of the lack of standardization in the field and some open issues about different areas of astrology. I've focused more over the course of the past 15 years on going back and understanding the history of astrology and trying to understand where the system came from and what its theoretical principles are, and trying to reconstruct as best as I could why astrologers use the different techniques that they do today and what the rationale is for them, what the philosophy is, and also trying to recover some techniques that were lost because over the past 2,000 years, astrology has changed a lot as it's moved from culture to culture and language to language. And it turns out that there were some things that were lost, and there are other things that were added during the course of that process. So for me, I've been focused more on trying to come up with and create a better form of astrology that's more effective in doing some of the things that it wants to do or claims to be able to do. Because if you can do that, then you can create a system that's going to be better at more regularly being able to pass tests like the rectification test or the chart comparison test or what have you.
Okay, that's really interesting. So another big thing I wanted to ask you about was whether or not astrology is predictive, because I expect there are probably different interpretations of this too. But do you see astrology itself as something that genuinely has potential to make predictions for the future, or do you view it maybe as a more as a form of a tool to make sense of events by, or a set of archetypes to understand ourselves by? Is it actually predictive or not?
Yeah, I think astrology, I've always argued that astrology is inherently predictive to some extent, at the very least, that any astrologer, because astrologers have debates about this and the extent to which things are predetermined, or the extent to which astrology is predictive, or the extent to which astrology should be used for prediction, and whether that's helpful, because there's been a split in modern times between psychological astrologers who want to use astrology primarily as a helpful tool within the context of counseling or psychology, and therefore making predictions is not necessarily the best use of it in that context, and instead they're just using it as an additional lens or additional angle in order to help people from a counseling standpoint. But there's other astrologers that focus more on the potential of astrology being predictive, and if it is predictive, how far they can take that and what they can do with it, or the perception that making predictions is the only way that we'll ever legitimize astrology to the public or in a scientific context or what have you, so that it becomes their mission to try to do it that way. In my view, I think astrology is inherently predictive, because if the basic premise of natal astrology is that the alignment of the planets at the moment a person is born has anything to say about a person's future character or events that will happen at some point in their life, then that means in the basic premise, there is some underlying assumption that it has some predictive potential, even in the most like restricted sense. So therefore, yeah, I think astrology is inherently predictive.
Great. And so, can you give me any specific examples of how this sort of mundane or predictive astrology has functioned in recent years? Like, for instance, were astrologers able to see COVID coming?
Yeah, there was a French astrologer named André Barbeau who, because one of the issues in doing different types of predictions is how astrologers make predictions primarily is by paying attention to astrological correlations as they're happening, and going back and studying past events when there's been a specific planetary alignment, and then what events occurred in the world at the time of those planetary alignments. And then they project that out in the future and say, well, if this planetary alignment coincided with this in the past, then by extension, when this planetary alignment reoccurs in the future, it should coincide with a similar event, right? So there's different astrologers, though, that have different interests or different specialties in terms of what type of events they want to go back in the past and study, or the extent to which a person has gone back and studied historical events in the past, because one of the points is that like not everybody is a historian. Like you actually have to have a genuine interest in history, or studying biographies, or studying different phases of human history, different types of events, in order to like go out of your way to study certain things. So all of that is a preface to say there was a French astrologer named André Barbeau who was very well known and very well regarded for his work in mundane astrology, which is making predictions about world events as well as studying historical alignments and events in the past. And he had made a specific study about the astrology of pandemics. So what he said, though, is he went back and he studied a bunch of planetary alignments in the past. And I have this quote from him. This was in an article that he wrote in 2012. And what was interesting about André Barbeau is that he actually died in 2019. So he died before the pandemic occurred. And he made this statement, this prediction in a specific article where he studied pandemics and the astrology of pandemics historically in past alignments. And he went back and looked at different ones. So what he said, and let me see if I can share this. This is from a previous episode that we did at one point, I think in 2020, talking about his predictions. But he said, quote, "Going back to the pandemics and going back to the past century, the four crises of 1918, 1954, 1968, and 1982 are obvious. And the two considerable being the first, the famous Spanish flu, which is said to have claimed 25 million lives, and the last one in AIDS, which is even more devastating and continues to be deadly. Since then, there's also been a small influenza surge in 2009 against the last lowest cyclical index of 2010. We may be in serious danger of a new pandemic at the 2020 through 2021 mark, at the lowest peak of the cyclic index of the 21st century, with the quintet of outer planets gathering over 100 degrees, a conjunction of Jupiter, Saturn, and Pluto can be more specifically, this is translated from French, so that's why the English is a little rough. And he continues, he says, and even specifically lend itself to the tissue of this imbalance. Nonetheless, this configuration can also transfer its core of dissonances to the terrain of geophysical disasters, which ultimately sparing the international affairs scene, nature, and society being indiscriminately affected. So, yeah, I mean, there are, if an astrologer like studied the history really closely and went back and compared previous pandemics, then one astrologer who did that, who was reputable, did issue a statement ahead of time about COVID. So that would be a recent instance of something like that.
That's really quite impressive. And generally among the astrological community, was there a sense that we were kind of heading up for some kind of disaster, even if we weren't quite sure what it was going to be?
Yeah. I mean, on the podcast, one of the funny things was on my podcast, when we did our year ahead forecast, one of our funny things was, you know, we're sometimes trying to relate this to people's lives and how individuals are going to experience it. And so one of the things we said in our year ahead forecast that we recorded in November of 2019, when we were talking about March of 2020, is, you know, we made a joke about it at the time, but that ended up being like weirdly prescient. But we said there will be no hugging in the third week of March of 2020. And we were sort of like joking and laughing about it in that context, that just like there was a huge, what you might classically think of when you're thinking about astrology, of just an alignment of planets all in the same spot in the sky that looked very difficult. And one of the primary things is that it was a conjunction of Saturn and Pluto. And the last time that Saturn and Pluto were conjoined, for example, was in the early 1980s, which was around the time of really the widespread sort of understanding of the AIDS epidemic and things like that. So you had sort of a recurrence of the same thing. And yeah, that was one of the ways that we sort of talked about it ahead of time at the time. But if you go back and listen to astrologers in their 2020 predictions, you'll understand that most astrologers were concerned about it being, you know, kind of a tough year just in general. But different astrologers also have different approaches to like how you should talk about what look like negative or difficult things coming up, frankly, because astrologers get worried, especially psychological astrologers get worried about the negative psychological impact of making bad predictions about the future. Because most astrologers are actually concerned about like the psychological well-being and saying things that are going to be helpful and things that are going to be productive, rather than just like freaking people out, or rather than doing something that's going to have a negative psychological impact on people. So one of the, for me, from like a philosophical perspective, things that was interesting about 2020 a little bit was seeing the other side of that, which is that for so much of the late 20th century, psychological astrologers focused so much on doing no harm with astrology and not making negative statements in astrology, even when things looked bad, that in 2020, we sort of saw the opposite side of that, which is that if you don't say what you see and if you hold back too much, then you're going to get the opposite side of that, which is that people are going to turn around and say, why didn't you say how bad this was going to be? Or you didn't predict this or something like that, when that might not be necessarily the case. So it was an interesting, I think, as a community thing that was sort of learned about the other side of that after several decades of the community going in the other side of just trying to be productive and helpful and do no harm. But it was kind of like the other side of, if you can do harm by leaving things out or by not being as explicit as you could be, perhaps.
I see. So there's a whole ethics aspect to it that I hadn't really considered. Yeah, and I know you cover this in a lot more depth with your sort of. I think you do a monthly forecast, don't you, of what's coming ahead? But yes, do you have anything, kind of any big predictions for what's kind of coming up in the next few years? Maybe not any disasters, if that's going to bring in an ethical element, but any sort of general predictions.
Yeah, I mean, I just did an episode in terms of mundane predictions in November with my friend Nick Diggin Best, where we talked about this thing that pretty much all astrologers have been talking about for quite a while now, based on a historical observation about the planet Uranus, that and it's more of like an American phenomenon, but it's just an observation that in history, the planet Uranus was in the sign of Gemini during pretty much the entire period of the American Revolutionary War, so that the United States was founded with Uranus in the sign of Gemini, or in other words, in a specific spot in the sky. And then Uranus is on an 84-year orbit. So it takes about 84 years to do a complete cycle around the zodiac and come back to where it started. And then when that happened, 84 years later, approximately, Uranus went back into Gemini for 6 or 7 years, because it spends 6 or 7 years in each sign of the zodiac. When Uranus returned to that sign from when the country was founded, almost perfectly aligns with the period of the Civil War in American history. So it was this hugely, again, tumultuous period in which the United States was involved in like a massive war, and there was a sense of like real conflict. So then 84 years after that, Uranus does another cycle all the way around the zodiac, and it comes back to where it started. And very closely, it came back to where it started in 1941 for, again, about 7 years, which then roughly coincided with the US involvement with World War II, all of a sudden being involved in another massive war and a massive turning point in terms of US history, and in terms of, what the US was before World War II versus what it was after that point. So astrologers have long noticed that correlation, because it's pretty just like striking looking at it in history. But the other part of that is that it's almost been 84 years again. So that transit is actually due to come up again in 2025. And Uranus is going to go into Gemini in 2025. And it's going to stay there, I think, until about 2032 or 2033. So, that's one of those instances where, again, we're just looking back at past correlations between celestial movements and earthly events, starting to draw data that there's been a similar correlation of major wars. Two of them were external wars, and one of them was an internal war, a civil war, but nonetheless, they've been major conflicts. And so by extension, we could kind of expect that there would be another major defining conflict that would take place between 2025 and 2032 that would be on the level of World War II, the Civil War, and the American Revolutionary War. So that's one of the most interesting, although startling and like not super happy observations that I've been tracking in terms of mundane astrology recently. But it's one that we'll find out pretty soon over the course of the next decade if that correlation holds up and continues to be true.
I certainly hope not, but based on the way things are going, I mean, it wouldn't surprise me too much. So not necessarily another civil war per se, necessarily, but it could just be an escalation of the kind of divides we're seeing at the moment, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, well, what's funny is we originally did this episode 10 years ago. Nick Diggenbest, the guest that I had on for that episode, he had published a book about it in 2012, or maybe it was actually 2013, but it was still about a decade ago. We did that episode, and at that point, it was even further removed from like the reality of we couldn't see how that would be relevant at all, but we still just noted the correlation historically and noted that we were getting close to it about a decade later, so that we had some like trepidation going into it. And so what was funny about returning to that topic again now is that we have, much clearer sense that there's a few possible ways in which that could manifest that are suddenly clearer now that we're much closer to it, in terms of there being both internal division within the country and like recent events in terms of attempts to like, overthrow or interrupt the democratic process and other like internal issues like that. But then also suddenly the recent explosion or return of external conflicts, like with Russia, or even to a lesser extent with China and things like that. So, just focusing on that one correlation, we can't say just using that single one, like what specific manifestation it should be. But then that would be a question, is if there ends up being some major war, will that be sufficient as a sort of demonstration, or would that be sufficient, to somebody like you, of like, okay, there's something going on there. This might be worth investigating further. We might not know why that's doing that, why that's working that way, or how that could be possible, but it would rise to the level of that's genuinely interesting enough that perhaps we should put some like research into that area of whatever's going on there in terms of the world and in terms of cosmology and things like that.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. And my next question, which is, I guess, somewhat related to that, is what does astrology have to say about the relationship between fate and free choice? And I'm sure there's probably different schools of thought on this. And yes, I know determinism versus free will is kind of a question that cuts to the heart of philosophy anyway, and maybe nobody has any good answers. But from an astrological perspective, does having our fate written in the stars mean we haven't got the ability to change things necessarily? What's your take on that?
I mean, I want to be careful. Every astrologer has different views on like fate and free will, and some of that's influenced by their approach to astrology, and it's also partially influenced by their personal philosophy or their religious beliefs or their cosmological beliefs or different things like that. And to the extent that I'm speaking as a representative for like the astrological community or all astrologers, I don't want to focus too much on my like personal view on that. But I will say that if the premise of astrology is true, as we've said, especially if the premise of natal astrology is true, that the alignment of the planets at the moment a person was born has something to say about their character and their future, even though as a baby they haven't really developed that yet. It's saying something about the potentiality of the individual and the potentiality of their life before it's fully manifested. And to the extent that we've already established then that if that's true, that astrology is somewhat inherently predictive, then it does imply that there's more about individuals' lives, or there's something about individuals' lives that might be fated or predetermined, or that there might be some concept of fate that does actually exist in the world, and that astrology somehow is a means or a tool or technology for looking into that. And actually in my book, that's pretty much the most important central thesis of my book, is that somebody around the first century BCE created a system, specifically like the system of Western astrology that's still used today, 2,000 years later, they created a construct for using astrology in order to study fate in a person's life, and that's part of the purpose of astrology in general. So, like, broadly speaking, I think that's the answer, but there's different astrologers have different conclusions about, so even if things are partially predetermined or partially fated, like how far that goes, and does that mean that everything's predetermined and everything's fated, or does that mean that there's just certain things that are predetermined in a broader sense? And there's a lot of different conclusions about that, which partially then gets connected with like how you're practicing astrology and what you're using it for. Because if you're using it in a more psychological sense, then you might have a more limited view on fate. Because there's some people that believe that an astrological chart only pertains to like their character or psychological things, whereas there's other astrologers that say that the chart can actually describe concrete external circumstances and events in a person's life. So you're going to have different views on fate and fatedness depending on what your approach is to that. And even in those two approaches, there's going to be, different or wildly different approaches to just determining how much things are predetermined.
Okay, fascinating. And yes, I gather that your background is in Hellenistic astrology, which, as I understand it, and as you've been kind of alluding to there, maps closely onto Hellenistic philosophy. So I was wondering how these older forms of astrology compare to the styles that are popular today, and what the value is really understanding the historical basis.
Sure. So the answer to that is like twofold. On the one hand, the value to studying the historical basis is that even though there were long empirical traditions of astrology in Mesopotamia, in like modern day Iraq, going back about 4,000 years, and there were long traditions of astrology in Egypt prior to that time for about 2,000 years. Those traditions intersected and were merged in about the 1st century BCE in Hellenistic Egypt. And there was a bunch of additional concepts and techniques and other things that were introduced at that time to create a sort of system for interpreting birth charts. And that's the system essentially that's persisted over the past 2,000 years. And that system was created around the time of the Roman Empire, but then eventually the Roman Empire sort of rose and fell. And then astrology was transmitted at that point to the Arabic-speaking world, to the Islamic world around the 7th and 8th centuries. And then astrology flourished there during the Middle Ages. But then eventually it was transmitted back to Europe through translations from Arabic into Latin. And then eventually people stopped writing in Latin and started writing astrology books in other European languages. Like the first major English textbook on astrology was written by William Lilly in London in 1647. So my point is just that astrology over the past 2,000 years was transmitted a bunch of times from language to language and culture to culture. And while the astrologers would always look back and draw on the previous philosophical and empirical and other traditions that they had access to in translation up to that point, they often had a limited number of translations to draw on. So they couldn't always draw on the entirety of the previous astrological tradition. And so they would miss things, or things would get forgotten about or left out. And there was a number of techniques, sometimes predictive techniques, that help astrology to be more effective predictively that weren't transmitted. So part of the focus recently in the astrological community over the past 3 decades has been going back to recover older astrological texts from the Renaissance and medieval and Hellenistic periods, to translate those texts into modern languages, to reconstruct and understand the systems that they used, because they often used systems that were somewhat different than what we use today, and then find ways to integrate that information into whatever the current prevailing astrological paradigm is. So that's the value to that. The ways in which it was different, that ancient astrology is different, is that it tended to be a little bit more geared towards prediction as opposed to just character analysis. And even though modern astrology and contemporary, especially pop astrology, is primarily focused on character analysis and telling you things about, your actions or your psychology or things like that, that's actually a very recent phenomenon that's only occurred over the past century, where astrology shifted to be largely about psychology, which kind of matched the rise of contemporary psychology in general over the course of the 20th century. But prior to that time, astrologers were more focused on making concrete predictions about a person's future. And so part of the advantage of going back and studying ancient astrology was the potential, at least, of recovering a system that should be more capable from a predictive context, which then naturally is going to be helpful when astrologers are trying to do tests or other things like that.
It sounds to me like, in a sense, astrology sort of follows the intellectual trends of the time. With in the past, it was much more focused on sort of prediction, and that kind of fit with prevailing philosophies. And today, it's much more psychologically focused. Would you say that's the case?
Yeah, because I think part of the reason why astrology was so popular, like, it's a little hard for me to tell in the Hellenistic period. It's like a chicken or the egg scenario, but Stoicism was super popular in the ancient world around the time that astrology became really popular. Although it's not really clear to me if, astrology became popular because there was already a prevalent philosophy that said that everything is predetermined and that you should accept all events that happen in your life as having the same value, because it's not a good idea to get overly depressed if bad things happened or overly excited if good things happen, but instead to maintain a sort of equilibrium. And then there's this system that comes along that tells you what your future is, so that you know what you have to accept in the future and can kind of like not be caught off guard by anything that happens. And I don't know if astrology became popular because Stoicism was already popular, or if Stoicism became popular because astrology was already becoming popular during that period, because they're kind of intertwined. But there is definitely a sense where, when astrologers are normal, everyday people who are just existing in whatever the contemporary world is, and they're practicing within the religious or scientific or philosophical sort of paradigm of their times. And so whatever those paradigms are, they will try to adapt their views on astrology to that paradigm. But then those paradigms change. But the point is just that the astrology is often very reflective of its times. And that actually, in the history of science, has been the initial rationale over the past century for why many academics have sort of justified going back and recovering a lot of ancient texts on astrology, or doing studies of ancient astrology within the context of the history of science, because they argue that the astrologers, in their interpretations of charts and other things like that, are always reflecting to some extent the contemporary viewpoint of their times, sometimes much more so than any other ancient source that you can find, because they're consulting with everyday individuals and they're trying to make statements about those people's lives.
Oh, that's super interesting. So another area I was curious about was, obviously, our understanding of the universe, scientifically speaking, has evolved a lot in recent years. We now know the universe to be vastly bigger than, say, we thought it was 2,000 years ago. And obviously, we know there are exoplanets. There's so much else going on astronomically than what we were aware of in the past. Has that affected astrology at all?
The one thing, extra solar planets and other things like that don't necessarily affect astrology. One of the things that has affected and changed astrology has been things like the discovery of like the outer planets, for example, like the discovery of Uranus and Neptune and Pluto. Astrologers had a system up to that point where for 2,000 years, they only drew on the 7 traditional quote unquote planetary bodies, or 7 celestial bodies, the visible planets, which in the night sky just look like, stars, just like every other star. But then over a long enough period of time, if you keep paying attention to those stars, you notice that they move through the night sky, unlike the other stars. So for many centuries, astrologers only used the planets that were known about. But then all of a sudden, when these new planetary or new celestial bodies were discovered that could be seen only through telescopes, astrologers quickly did start trying to study those planets in charts and look at what they correlated with in history, and then developing an understanding of what those new celestial bodies meant based on those empirical observations. And then from that point forward, they became integrated into the system as just like new components. And those new components didn't erase everything that came before up to that point, but they just added additional variables that were useful in reading charts. So that's one of the ways in which astrologers sometimes adapt to, and astrology changes based on new scientific or other developments.
Okay, and I remember reading a few years ago that NASA had identified a 13th zodiac sign, and for that reason, everyone's sun signs had shifted by one or something. I saw this in kind of magazines, so I'm not sure how credible it is, but do you remember reading the same thing? And is that something that's seriously affected astrology or not?
No, I mean, you'll see this story come up in the news periodically. It comes up every few months or every few years. The same exact story will go viral. And it's usually, it's a little mixture of a few different things, because on the one hand, it's a bit of skeptical propaganda, but to sort of mess with astrologers to a certain extent. But it's also based on a misconception about the difference between the tropical zodiac that Western astrologers use, which is aligned with the seasons, versus the sidereal zodiac that is based on the constellations. And it's based on a misperception that most of the public has, which is that Western astrologers, or that the signs of the zodiac are based purely on the constellations, when in fact, Western astrologers for the past 2,000 years have very consistently been using a system that measures the distance between the equinoxes and the solstices, and then divides that circle into 12 segments, 12 equal segments. That's the system that astrologers have been using for their reference point of what they call the signs of the zodiac over the past 2,000 years. And that hasn't changed. There's nothing about that that's shifted, to the extent that the equinoxes and the solstices are still exactly where they are today, where they were 2,000 years ago or 4,000 years ago or what have you. So it's actually not true that within that context that anything's changed about the signs of the zodiac as they've been used over the past 2,000 years. It's just a thing that sometimes, again, sometimes it's like outsiders or skeptics that like to bring up what they perceive as like a mistake or a shortcoming. Like they assume that astrologers don't know basic astronomical information about how the seasons align with the constellations, and that astrologers are just mistaken about these things, instead of realizing that astrologers are deliberately using this specific reference system that has to do with the equinoxes and the solstices, and that these other points about the constellations aren't necessarily relevant in that context. That's like a sort of complicated version of that. But if you look back, like you'll see this story goes viral periodically, like every few years. And it's always framed as if it's like a clickbait title where it's framed as if this is a new discovery and NASA has just discovered this and astrologers have been wrong, or everything has shifted, or everything else. And the point underlying that is always either something that's sort of like sensationalist on the one hand, or it's coming from a perspective of trying to make people doubt or sort of like question the validity of astrology, and make astrologers look like idiots that don't know basic facts about astronomy or something like that, which is just untrue. But yeah, I would research that and look it back, and you'll just see this same news story going back like decades, and just coming up over and over again, and always framed in that sense as if this is some sort of new discovery that changes everything. But it's never coming from like within the astrological community. It's always coming from sources that already reject astrology to begin with. So there's a question about like whether they're actually the ones that are the arbiters of, the techniques that astrologers are using, and whether that's actually true or appropriate.
Well, thanks for clearing that up. I thought it seemed a bit strange. And as you say, clickbaity, I'd seen the same thing a few times and thought there was probably a bit more to it than met the eye with that one. So yeah, I appreciate your response there.
Yeah. Well, when it originated, the one a few years ago, the last major version of that, like I actually traced it back because I talked about it in a podcast episode at the time, and it was just this random blog that was one of those blogs that's just trying to get traffic, sort of like a tabloid or something like that, like a celebrity tabloid. And it just created this like sensationalized story saying that NASA had discovered something new. But it's like NASA didn't announce anything new. There was nothing that actually went back to NASA announcing or saying anything. They were just trying to generate traffic onto this website in order to sell ads. But then somehow they were actually able to make it go viral, because typically when like a normal person that doesn't know anything hears that, but that has even like a slight interest or belief in astrology, or let's say just their sun sign, they'll click on that thinking like, oh, my sign has changed or something like that. And it genuinely does generate views and traffic and that's why it goes viral so often. But if you trace back the origins of it, it's often to somewhat questionable sources, or at least it was in that instance.
Hmm. And yeah, you kind of mentioned there about there are a lot of people today who do have a passing interest in astrology, perhaps more so now than I'd say there were a few years ago. And I'm certainly seeing kind of astrologies everywhere in terms of memes. There's so many memes about kind of people's rising signs and moon signs. And I think a certain understanding of astrology has entered kind of mainstream awareness more than it had a few years ago, maybe. And I'm curious what your views on that are, where you think this has come from.
Right. And I wanted to talk about that because that's the main approach and one of the main questions you had about astrology and the approach that you're taking in your book. And I wanted to clarify something about that that's really important to understand, which is that I don't know if your original question, if you were thinking that this was a byproduct or connected with the pandemic, but one point that's really important when it comes to astrology is that the sudden rise in the popularity and this new sort of generational interest in astrology amongst younger people, which is part of what it was, that started actually before the pandemic. It started back in the 2017 and 2018 timeframe, because I actually did a podcast episode on it back then where I talked with two other astrologers, because it started with the New York Times, I think in late 2017 and early 2018. The New York Times published this article saying, what's with the recent rise in the popularity of astrology? And then something happened at that point where it created this sort of cascade or this domino effect where all of a sudden a bunch of other publications then started publishing articles also asking and noting the recent rise in the popularity of astrology. And what's funny, if you go back and you listen to my episode about that, I think it was from early 2018, like January of 2018, is, and I talked to two other astrologers about it. I was kind of skeptical at the time about whether it was true that there had been a bump in the popularity of astrology, or if this was just like sort of like a media thing saying that there was, because I was observed. For example, I noted at the time that books on astrology, like if you go to a normal bookstore, that the publication of astrology books, it seemed like had been dwindling over the past decade, where most astrology stores used to have like a shelf of astrology books, if not like a bookcase. But I noticed that like books were just like becoming less and less on astrology, less and less popular at bookstores. Although I wasn't sure if that was just a byproduct of like the publishing industry struggling in general. But we actually, in this episode in early 2018, like kind of debated whether it was true that astrology was becoming more popular. And I was a little skeptical at the time, but then over the course of the next year, it was really clear, it became really clear that no, something actually had really shifted, because all of a sudden astrologers were seeing this influx of a lot of new younger astrologers, especially in their 20s, into the astrological community. And that continued to increase from 2018 to 2019 into 2020. So one of the things that I wanted to note is just that shift and that sudden increase in the popularity of astrology had started well before the pandemic. And it wasn't just a side effect of the pandemic or of people, searching for answers during a really difficult time or something like that. It was something, whatever it was due to, that started well before that.
Interesting. And do you have any sort of big overarching ideas what it might be due to?
It was some sort of generational thing, because it was especially people in their 20s. And it was really notable because for the longest time in the mid 2000s, when I I started studying astrology in 1999, and then I started interfacing with other astrologers in person in the astrological community when I started going to a school for astrology in the mid 2000s, and I started attending conferences when I was in my early 20s. And for the longest time, I was always the youngest person at conferences, and I would very rarely meet other young astrologers. And I even became involved in and eventually became the president of an organization that helped to advocate for younger astrologers or helped to provide them with resources in order to encourage more young astrologers to pursue education in the field, or at least if they chose to study the subject, just to provide like a welcoming context to welcome them into the community and help them attend conferences by providing scholarships or other things like that. But there was actual articles from back then where the older generation of astrologers, who tended to be the baby boomer generation who were born in the 1940s, and to some extent like the hippie or the counterculture generation who came of age in the 1960s, that was the last time there was a huge influx of like younger astrologers into the community, was in the 1960s and 70s. And then after that point, there was this large generational gap. And for the longest time, that older generation of astrologers was always asking, is this it? Is astrology dying out? Or will there be like a younger generation that comes in and takes over at some point? And I have quotes from astrologers in the mid 2000s actually like asking and reflecting on that question. So that generation, eventually there was some sort of generational change, and it happened in the 2018, 2019, and 2020 timeframe. A bunch of younger people came into the community. I'm sure there's some like astrological reason for it or something like that. I have a hard time with practical reasons. I mean, the only practical thing that I could point to is, 10 years ago, if you asked somebody what their zodiac sign is, that would mean their sun sign, right? That's like what most people, I think our age, would associate with that question. But nowadays, most people know their quote unquote big three, their sun, moon, and rising signs. And part of the reason for that is there has been a shift in terms of the technology has changed, and the availability of free software or apps in order to calculate your birth chart has suddenly seen a rise. So first starting with websites, like for example, when I got into astrology in 1999, there was just one website where you could go to get a copy of your birth chart calculated. But over the course of the past 20 years, now there's just a ton of different websites you can go to for free to get that calculated. So that was one step. But then over the past decade, we've also seen the rise of mobile apps, like different apps that a person can download and install on their phone that'll calculate your chart or will tell you what your sun, moon, and rising is. And that's another instance where it's kind of a chicken or the egg scenario, because I don't know if it was that the apps are what made it so that suddenly that the apps became popular on their own, and therefore everybody could then know their sun, moon, and rising, and that raised interest and like awareness and consciousness of astrology. Or alternatively, because it's equally possible that it's just that those apps became super successful because for some reason there was this larger generational interest in astrology, and the apps just were able to kind of like ride that wave. But whatever it is, I do know that generally speaking, because of the availability of apps and websites and free options for calculating your birth chart, that there's been this public shift in the conception of astrology where now people know more about it, and they know that it's a little bit more complicated than what a general person knew astrology was like 10 years ago, to the extent that 10 years ago they only knew about their sun sign, and now they know that there's at least 3 different zodiac signs that make up something about their personality. So, I think that's part of what's changed things, and maybe that creates more of an on-ramp potentially into then discovering the birth chart and discovering that astrology is more complicated than you initially thought, and that more people therefore seeing that and discovering the advanced forms of astrology then perhaps get interested in it and decide that that's something they'd like to study further in order to, in the same way that I did, in terms of wanting to see how far they can take it or what kind of predictions you can make with it or what have you.
And that idea you said of maybe the kind of original sort of hippie counterculture sort of having a kind of comeback is something I'm exploring in other chapters of the book as well, because I am seeing it in a few different ways. A lot of these sort of old, kind of hippie ideas seem to be revived in some sense. So I feel like there is a kind of an element of that. And it's interesting to see how that intersects with technology for, the younger generation today.
Yeah.
So I definitely want to look further into this.
One of the things I'm nervous about, one of the shifts I have seen is I did notice a decline in skepticism over the past decade. I feel like and when I say skepticism, I mean like the professional skeptical community. Like, I don't know how familiar you are with that, but I feel like when I originally came into astrology and originally was studying for the first 10 years in the 2000s, that there was a much more robust scientific skepticism community that was like, had very specific designated leaders like James Randi or Michael Shermer or other people like that. And they had, conferences and magazines and podcasts and blogs and other things that were very active and very sometimes like aggressive about going after things that were viewed as being pseudoscience or were viewed as being against scientific thinking. And I felt like that community was much more robust in the 2000s. And I feel like something happened over the course of the past decade where it kind of fell apart or became less robust. Or I know that there was the loss of certain leaders, like James Randi, for example, passed away, or others got caught up in like political issues, like Richard Dawkins, and some of the shifts in different things due to social changes, or even to a certain extent, Michael Shermer got caught up in some of that. And I don't know if that's the reason, but it just seems like for some reason, there was a weird timing there where while astrology was getting more popular, there's also been a decline in skepticism. And, from my perspective as an astrologer, there's probably some specific generational markers for that, or like outer planet markers. And there's some that come to mind that I think about, but that's sort of like a separate explanation for just like observing the phenomenon of seeing both of those communities change over the past decade.
And you say this concerns you. Would you in the astrology community want there to be a thriving skeptical movement alongside it? How is that something you actively would like?
I mean, I would, to the extent that like I actually myself, ironically, as an astrologer, like I'm kind of skeptical about a number of things because I entered the community through a more new age and to a certain extent a somewhat like conspiracy theory avenue where there was some stuff that I got into at first that I later realized was like not true and was like not an accurate reflection of reality. And so I've often been interested in like skeptical stuff. And I've even attended like a skeptic conference once called Skeptic Camp here in Colorado. And I think there's a value towards skepticism because sometimes that's really important and necessary, especially in a time period in which, misinformation and people just accepting different things from social media has become so much more prevalent, and where people aren't taught critical thinking skills to a certain extent, or at least a time when critical thinking skills are more necessary and important for society than ever. There's like a certain extent where having a more robust skeptical community would maybe be a good thing societally. And even to a certain extent for astrology, because I don't think astrologers should always take everything for granted, and they should question, and they should not just take astrology as a faith or a religion or a belief system. And I don't think most astrologers do, but it's always good to have some check on that tendency or what have you. But on the other side of that, as an astrologer, there's also a downside to that, which is, there's nothing worse than somebody that has an ideological reason for feeling like it's okay to attack somebody else, or who's sort of approaching things from a purely ideological reason, even if they have no firsthand experience with things. And in my experience of interacting with most like professional skeptics that make a job out of it or make that like a hobby of some sort, it becomes more of an ideological thing where most of the ones that I've interacted with aren't very familiar with astrology. And if you ask them some basic questions about the subject, it becomes really clear most of the time that they haven't really studied it, but they're still adamantly like convinced, or sometimes even like militantly convinced that it's wrong, that it's not true, and that it's a bad thing, but also that astrologers are actively harming or trying to rip people off. So they therefore have like almost a ideological justification for doing anything they can to like stop them, or to mess with them, to troll them, or to do other things generally to stop that from happening, because they truly believe that astrologers are up to no good and that they're like bad people that are hurting people, which is not necessarily the case. And it partially stems from their lack of familiarity with the actual astrological community. But there's something about that piece of things that I'm not looking forward to. And I do suspect that there's going to be a shift at some point in the next decade. Because I partially think it has to do with Neptune going through Pisces over the past decade. And that's going to shift here in a few years. And I think that might be one of the changes, is a shift in the skeptical community starting to make a bit of a comeback at some point, and starting to reorganize and reorient themselves in whatever the new time frame is that we're existing, and sort of moving beyond whatever the previous approaches had been from the 1990s and other things that were appropriate then that maybe aren't working as well now.
Interesting. Well, one of the big themes I'm looking to cover in my book is to what extent and in what way spirituality can kind of coexist with critical thinking. Like, can we bridge the two? Can you be a skeptic and at the same time have a sort of, be involved in a certain kind of spiritual practice? I'm not sure whether you'd even call astrology a spiritual practice, but yes, to what extent can they coexist? And I think we're perhaps on the same page about wanting to be an element of critical thinking in all of these enterprises.
Yeah, I think that's really important in whatever you're doing, to have a certain element of critical thinking, and to not take things for granted has always been like one of my main things, is just like, don't take anything for granted. I try not to do that with my audience. I try to assume when I do a podcast that they don't have any idea what I'm talking about. And so I have to introduce it from the ground up and then get to the more advanced things. But also with myself, I try to strive on a regular basis not to take things for granted, and to try to research or get to the bottom of things, even for like news stories. If everyone on social media is saying something happened, just trying to get back to the source and read it firsthand myself, so that I understand at least what the basis is of the public opinion that's formed. I don't think astrology is, what was the way that you phrased that? Like a religion or spirituality?
A spiritual enterprise. I'm not sure whether that's accurate to say that.
I think that astrology does, this is debated in the community, but I think at the very least, at even the most restrictive sense, that astrology, if it works, and if you're using it or practicing it, or if you're observing it happening firsthand, that it does raise like philosophical or cosmological or spiritual questions about the world, and about like what we're doing here and what this means. And, does fate exist, or destiny, or all of these other things? It certainly raises all of those issues and naturally leads one to contemplate them. And to that extent, it does start interfacing and getting into an area of religion and of spirituality and belief, which is like the broader ways of how we like contextualize our lives and what our meaning and purpose is here. And that's the problem with astrology, is that it really straddles both fields and has a foot in both fields. It's not entirely scientific and it's not entirely religious, but it has elements of science to the extent that it has this empirical component, but then it also has these religious and philosophical components at the same time. And on the one hand, that's a downside to astrology, or a downside to being an astrologer in society, because astrology then is actually rejected by both camps, typically, where you get rejected both from a scientific standpoint, that it's not scientific enough, or it's not validated within our current worldview, or by the current scientific studies, or what have you. But then it also gets rejected oftentimes from a religious standpoint as well, where for Christianity, for example, it was originally rejected partially through issues about fate and free will, because Christianity really emphasized free will. And to the extent that astrology was partially saying that things might be more predetermined, it was like it ran up against the religious sort of orthodoxy of things. So that puts astrology in a really precarious position in society where it's on the outs of both religion and science. But then it's also, at the same time, probably one of its virtues is that it's very unique in that sense, to the extent that it could have its foot in both worlds and could potentially like bridge both worlds to some extent. To whatever extent that's true, raises some really interesting possibilities that to me at least make it even more interesting, even if it contains or carries some drawbacks.
That's really fascinating and something I'm going to have to think more about. And so I'm aware I've taken up a lot of your time already, so I've only really got one final question, which is a big open-ended one to finish with. Are there any big misconceptions about astrology that you'd like to debunk?
Are there any big misconceptions? We've talked about so many of them at this point. I think, the biggest one from skeptics is just the idea that astrologers are cold reading people, or that they're malicious, or that they don't believe in what they do, or other things like that, or that that astrology only works through confirmation bias, or things like that. And I think so many of those things are just misconceptions or preconceptions or prejudices and assumptions, rather than people like looking into something and having a firsthand experience and deciding for themselves that it's true or not true. And I realize, putting controls on things and doing things in a controlled scientific context because of a fundamental belief in the fallibility of human perception is part of the scientific method at this point in time. But there's also an extent to which I think it's important for people to actually study things themselves instead of taking for granted what somebody else says, because that's so often so many of these things, like the 13th zodiac or the confirmation bias things. People that are in a more skeptical mindset will tend to just accept these arguments and repeat them, but they haven't actually looked into it themselves. So I think I would just encourage people to look into it themselves and come to their own conclusions, rather than accepting something that somebody else says, because then that ironically becomes almost a matter of faith, even though the person doing it thinks that they're following the more scientific method or the scientific viewpoint. And that's a way in which, there's a weird contradiction in society to a certain extent about the science versus faith issue at this point. Are there any other misconceptions that you think of, or things that you think of in astrology that we haven't addressed?
No, nothing in particular. I suppose, as you say, 10 years ago, people thought about astrology, they were thinking about their sun sign. It's pretty easy to kind of refute, not every Taurus is going to have the same day, therefore astrology is not true,
Right.
But I feel like we probably have moved away from that, and most people nowadays are aware that there's a bit more to it than that.
Yeah, I guess that actually does raise a point, though, because we're still at that level in that most people, their understanding of astrology is still fundamentally about character analysis, and the idea that, now it's become, instead of just having one sign and whether that sign matches your personality, that you have three signs and whether those match your personality. But I think actually the more interesting thing about astrology, the thing that everybody really needs to investigate, is the most fundamental timing technique in astrology, which is the concept of transits, where you take your birth chart, which is the positions of the planets at the moment you were born, and then you see what happens in the future when different planetary alignments happen in a person's life, especially during important events in a person's life. And what will happen is that at important planetary alignments in the future that match up with your birth chart, that important events will happen in your life. That's one of the basic premises of predictive astrology and the concept of transits. And I always wish that more people understood that concept and would investigate it for themselves, because that's really the concept that has to be investigated if one wanted to determine if there's any validity to astrology. Is, can you predict events with transits, or alternatively have major planetary alignments at specific turning points, like important turning points in your life, actually lined up in a way that symbolically spoke to that situation or described it accurately. Like when a person had like their first child, or when they were recognized for an important award, or when they got married, or other things like that. The planets shouldn't be lining up with and showing that important turning points would happen at that point in your life when those important things happen. Yet for some reason, from the perspective of astrologers, they do. And I think if more people, especially more smart, like educated, even skeptical or science-minded people, investigated that and then saw those correlations, that they would be startled by it, but also that some of them would be so fascinated by it that they would probably choose to investigate it further as well. And then at some point, we'd probably get another Ptolemy type figure who's like a polymath, or a leader, or somebody that has training in a number of other scientific disciplines, who could help to create a sort of unified theory that could find a place for astrology in contemporary cosmology, better than somebody like myself, who's more of a historian, or better than some other astrologers who are horoscope writers or something like that. Astrologers actually need that. And I think it would be good for the astrological community if more, people that thought at high levels like that and had other training in other types of sciences were helping astrologers to like figure things out. I think that would be a good thing for the community and the world in general.
Do you see anybody coming up like that at the moment, or is that a bit of a pipe dream?
No, I mean, there's always periodically different people like that are operating or doing astrology or have a side interest in astrology. Most of the time, the biggest problem is just that that's like career suicide for anybody to be publicly sort of open about their astrological interests or astrological studies. So you'll get people like that have a personal interest in it or a personal study, but then it's only occasionally that you'll get somebody that actually tries to integrate that into their career. Like, for example, Richard Tarnas, for example, who, wrote in the early 90s, The Passion of the Western Mind, which was like it became a very popular sort of college textbook for studying the changes in Western thought through history and philosophy and science and everything else. But then it turned out that he was actually writing that as kind of like a precursor to this other book that was studying the history of astrology, and that actually went through and showed how important turning points in Western thought and scientific paradigms had actually coincided with specific planetary alignments in the past. And he published that book in like 2005 or 2004 as like a major thing. And a lot of people were surprised that he sort of like, came out as an astrologer. But it sort of takes things like that, but it's kind of a risky move for a person to do that. And only certain people find themselves in that position where they have the luxury of doing that, whereas others, I think it's more of a private thing.
I see. It's interesting you use the phrase come out as an astrologer there, because the other astrologer I spoke to used exactly the same phrase talking about herself. She almost had to come out to, publicly sort of state that she was into this. And
yeah, and I need to actually clarify that, because I don't want to get in trouble, because I know astrologers do commonly use that phrase because they have a similar experience, oftentimes, of trepidation in. Sometimes astrologers develop this as a hobby or a side interest. And there's a certain amount of risk that's involved in becoming public, either with their employer, their social circle, or even their family, about their interest in astrology. And there's a certain amount of risk sometimes in a person being open about that, because then they become the subject sometimes of presumptions or criticisms, because, there's all sorts of different potentially negative assumptions that a person might make about you if you say that you do astrology, that you practice astrology, you're interested in it. Like a skeptic will think you're an idiot, or you believe in a lot of things that aren't true, or you're actually actively against scientific progress, or that you're ripping people off. A religious person might think that you're, in league with the devil, or you're doing witchcraft, or other things like that. So astrologers do have a certain amount sometimes of risk, but at the same time, using that phrase is a little tricky, because it's not usually the same amount of risk that a person who's gay has in terms of like coming out and being open about their sexuality. And I want to be clear that I'm not, by using that phrase, fully trying to equate the two or trying to say that astrologers have the same level of potential difficulty in terms of that. But it's just an analogy that sometimes people that astrologers use because of the similar feeling of fear or like trepidation about being open with people in their life about what they do or what they believe, because it sometimes has major downsides to being open about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was definitely the sense I got from her as well, though she did say that it had gone a lot better than she thought, and people are very receptive to it, which to me sort of speaks to this sort of increased popularity of astrology among our demographic today, perhaps.
Yeah, I think it's definitely better than it used to be at different points, because I mean, both from a religious standpoint, it seems like that's becoming to a certain extent less of an issue. And maybe that has to do with society becoming less religious to a certain extent, or at least certain orthodox views not being as prevalent as they were before then. And then, yeah, there's greater acceptance among younger people, but it's like, on the other hand, you will still run into sometimes some issues if you say that. There's still definitely people who don't have favorable views of astrology. I mean, I think most polls that I read says that most scientific polls I've read said that it's only something like 25% or in the range of 25% of people, quote unquote, believe in astrology. And there's kind of an issue in terms of that phrasing, in terms of what that means by believe in astrology, that I've always been a little uncomfortable, or at least nervous about whether that's an accurate reflection of what it's trying to figure out. But even in that aside, if that's true, that means like that's only about like a quarter of society that thinks that astrology might be a legitimate phenomenon. And that leaves a whole, 75%, or even like, let's say 70% at the most generous, if we went up to 30% of belief in astrology. That's 70% of the population that doesn't think that that's a legitimate phenomenon, or thinks that it's evil, or that it's harmful or anti-scientific. So yeah, that gives you some interesting perspective in terms of just like, then thinking about the consequences of, if you are open about that, like what your just statistical likelihood, if you meet a stranger and tell them you're an astrologer, what the reaction to that is going to be.
Well, there's certainly a lot more to it than I thought there was when I began researching this subject, because I had quite a superficial knowledge of it to begin with, and I didn't appreciate the level of depth that actually goes into it. And I've really enjoyed the conversation with you. You've cleared up a lot of my own misconceptions about it, and I feel like I've got a lot to investigate further here. So I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for approaching me with these questions, and for being open to like recording this, just because I always I like having discussions like this, because part of my goal as an astrologer has always been trying to figure out how to explain what I do to people that aren't familiar with the subject. And so I kind of like or relish the opportunity, to the extent that I kind of see myself, sometimes there's like science educators like, Neil deGrasse Tyson or Bill Nye, or to a certain extent at one point like Richard Dawkins, or people like that try to explain science to the public, or people that aren't familiar with it. And I always felt like we needed something like that in the astrological community. So I've tried to a certain extent, amongst many other roles, to like play that role. So thanks for giving me the opportunity to like kind of discuss some of this today, and to help me to, express some of my thoughts about how it works and what the astrological community is about, and other things like that.
I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Yeah. All right. Well, good luck with the book. Let me know when it's out, and I look forward to reading it.
Thank you. I look forward to listening to your podcast more.
Special thanks to all the patrons that helped to support the production of this episode of the podcast through our page on patreon.com. In particular, shout out to the patrons on our producers tier, including Thomas Miller, Catherine Conroy, Christy Moe, Ariana Amour, Mandy Ray, Angelique Nambo, Issa Sabah, Jake Otero, Mimi Stargazer, and Jean-Marie Kaplan. If you appreciate the work I'm doing here on the podcast and you'd like to find a way to support it, then please consider becoming a patron through our page on patreon.com. In exchange, you can get access to bonus content that's only available to patrons of the podcast, such as early access to new episodes, the ability to attend the live recording of the monthly forecast episodes, our monthly Auspicious Elections podcast, or another exclusive podcast series called the Casual Astrology Podcast, or you can even get your name listed in the credits at the end of each episode. For more information, visit patreon.com/astrologypodcast. If you're looking to get an astrological consultation, we have a list of recommended astrologers at theastrologypodcast.com/consultations. The astrologers on the list are friends of the podcast that have been featured in different episodes over the years, and they have different specialties such as natal astrology, electional astrology, synastry, rectification, or horary astrology. You can get a 10% discount when you book a consultation with one of the astrologers on our list by using the promo code AstrologyPodcast. The astrology software that we use and recommend here on the podcast is called SolarFire for Windows, which is available for the PC at alabe.com. Use the promo code AP15 to get a 15% discount. For Mac users, we recommend a software program called Astrogold for Mac OS, which is from the creators of SolarFire for PC, and it includes both modern and traditional techniques. You can find out more information at astrogold.io, and you can use the promo code AstroPodcast15 to get a 15% discount. If you'd like to learn more about my approach to astrology, then I'd recommend checking out my book titled Hellenistic Astrology, The Study of Fate and Fortune, where I go over the history, philosophy, and techniques of ancient astrology, taking people from beginner up through intermediate and advanced techniques for reading birth charts. You can get a print copy of the book through Amazon or other online retailers, or there's an ebook version available through Google Books. I also recently published a new translation of the anthology of the 2nd century astrologer Vedius Valens, which is one of the most important sources for understanding the practice of ancient astrology. You can find that by searching for Vedius Valens, the anthology on Amazon or other online book retailers. If you're really looking to expand your studies of astrology, then I would recommend my Hellenistic Astrology course, which is an online course on ancient astrology where I take people through basic concepts up through intermediate and advanced techniques for reading birth charts. There's over 100 hours of video lectures as well as guided readings of ancient texts, and by the time you finish the course, you will have a strong foundation in how to read birth charts, as well as make predictions. You can find out more information at courses.theastrologyschool.com. I also recently launched a new course there called the Birth Time Rectification course, where I teach students how to figure out your birth time using astrology when the birth time is either unknown or uncertain. You can find out more information about that at theastrologyschool.com. Each year, the podcast releases a set of astrology calendar posters for the coming year, and we've just released our 2023 planetary alignments and planetary movements posters, which are now available on our website at theastrologypodcast.com/store. There you can also pick up our 2023 electional astrology report, where Lisa Scheim and I went through the next 12 months and we picked out the single most auspicious date for each month using the principles of electional astrology. You can get that at theastrologypodcast.com/2023 report. And finally, thanks to our sponsors, including the Mountain Astrologer magazine, which is a quarterly astrology magazine, which you can read in print or online at mountainastrologer.com. Finally, thanks also to the Northwest Astrology Conference, which is happening May 25th through the 29th, 2023, just outside of Seattle. This year's conference is going to be a hybrid conference where you can either attend online or in person. Find out more information at norwac.net.